Hi, my name is Giselle Donnelly. It's my pleasure to welcome you to a special anniversary edition of the Eastern Front podcast. I'm joined by my colleagues,
Iulia and
Dalibor. Giselle, I wanted to start with you, if you don't mind, and this broader question of America's role in the current war in Ukraine. Obviously, the United States pledged to send Abrams tanks to Ukraine. President Biden ruled out sending F-16 fighter jets. There is this looming question of what happens to U.S. support over time as this war goes on, and whether we really are setting Ukraine for victory in this war, or whether we are simply trying to keep the fighting going. To use the words of President Biden, whether we are going to do whatever it takes. It might not be the same as doing whatever it takes for Ukraine to win.
Well, Dalibor, you've asked the most anxiety-producing question that you possibly could right at the start. I'm nervous, I have to say. The Biden administration has both exceeded my expectations and driven me to despair, sometimes within the space of 15 or 20 minutes or so. We're having this conversation at sort of the 1-year mark of our podcast, and the same timeline in regard to the Ukraine war. And President Biden has been somewhat Sphinx-like throughout the course of the year. You mentioned the tank controversy. That sort of also demonstrates that even when we do the right thing, we sort of do it in the most offhanded and backward and self-defeating way possible. At the same time, this past year has reinforced, I think, almost beyond question, the centrality of the United States to European security. So, will the Biden administration continue this pattern of sort of just-in-time, reluctant contributions and, let's just call it escalation, or provision of greater capabilities and greater quantities of equipment to the Ukrainian army? I think that's unfortunately the most likely outcome. And so he's playing with fire both on the battlefield but also on the home front. And he's now confronted by a House of Representatives that is certainly, when it comes to headline grabbing, dominated by the MAGA right, which is, very much against support for Ukraine, wants to cut it off as severely and as fast as they possibly can. They probably don't have the votes to do that, but the president will have to work harder, I think, to secure the transfers that Ukraine needs. Also, the final sort of point on this, the Eastern Europeans have given about all that they have to give, especially if you measure it by former Warsaw Pact equipment that they've been husbanding ever since the end of the Cold War, and also in the case of the tanks, the German Leopards that they have received over the last 20 years or so. So we are really at a moment where the United States must be the arsenal of democracy, because all the other arsenals have sort of been emptied out. So other than the Ukrainian will to fight, the most important question in the war for the coming year is the question of United States support and its continued willingness in the 11th hour and 59th minute to provide the leadership that Europe needs to stay engaged.
It strikes me that there is a tension between the sort of theory of the conflict that the administration operates and the drivers of domestic support for arming Ukraine. So if your idea is that you want to help, but you want to do it gradually in small increments so as to prevent the conflict from inflaming itself too much and spreading further, or having a sort of disproportionate Russian reaction, that does not make for a form of support that leads to a quick Ukrainian victory. Yet to sustain the support, like, you need wins. You need to be able to tell a story like we were able to tell in September, with Ukrainians retaking massive chunks of the territory. The more you do what the administration is doing, the more it will start looking like a forever war, and the more people will say, why are we doing this? What are we getting out of it? It's a stalemate. Let's get the heck out of there.
And I think maybe to add to this and put things into perspective, what strikes me right now, 1 year into the war, is that Biden and Washington generally has gone out of their way to not define the end of the war, right? We're at the same point that we were discussing last summer. That, of course, builds into what you were saying, that it drags the war on. There's the fear of escalation is still the dominant sort of taboo topic that nobody talks about except Biden in a couple of op-eds. And you said this a bit earlier, Giselle, we talked about the midterms, how crucial the midterms were. In the midterms, we've seen that Ukraine has not been a topic, and we're now beyond the midterms into a big unknown. We still don't know exactly how much the support for Ukraine has been reduced in terms of voting numbers on the Hill. And we still don't know to what extent this will be a continued trend of reduction, whether now we're in January, February, whether in December of this year we will have significantly less Ukraine support, significantly more Ukraine fatigue, and we will have moved on to the next interesting conflict here in Washington and in the White House, etc., or we will be comparable to where we are now. And I think this is striking for both sides of the Atlantic, how little we know.
Well, the president has been more than a little passive in rallying support. I mean, he's president. He's got a lot of things on his plate, and, with various debt ceilings and other pressing domestic issues on his front, and entering already the 2024 presidential campaign season. You have to wonder whether that sort of sustained use of the bully pulpit is something that is on his horizon. But you're quite right, Dalibor. It makes for this sort of weird, multiple moving pieces dynamic where material support for Ukraine is dependent on Ukrainian success on the battlefield, and domestic support in the United States, and domestic support in the United States, and forward leading by the Biden administration is necessary to get our allies to contribute material support to Ukraine. So you have how these billiard balls bouncing off one another in a way that's very difficult to predict.
I guess you have to also wonder how the politics of this is going to play out in the United States going into the presidential campaign season. It may be, a very slight sort of pushback against what you suggested about President Biden's passive role. It could be that if he were more vocal, and if he used, the weight of his office to make this case for the support for Ukraine, there would be this risk of Ukraine becoming a real sort of partisan dividing line. And we have really no idea who's running on the Republican side and what they'll say about Ukraine. But if you don't want to create too much of a space for sort of Ukraine skeptics by sort of hugging and embracing the issue too strongly.
The Republican Party, people like House Leader Mitch McConnell have been stalwart in their support for Ukraine and has much of the Republican Party in the Senate. The House leadership has been, also tepid and, hemming and hawing. But the thing that so I'll just make this sort of my final, thing about which I need psychological counseling is whether the House Republicans who can't accomplish, they have their oversight function, and they're going to be talking about Hunter Biden's laptop and FBI malfeasance for a long time, but where they could be sort of thrown a bone, it seems to me, is on Ukraine support. They can't achieve really anything material legislatively, but again, given the sort of shallowness and the decline in support for Ukraine, particularly amongst farther right Republicans and conservatives, whether that will be the thing where Biden steps back, where McConnell is kind of offset by a weaker position in the House.
So basically, we are in a situation in the United States dominated by, at least here and on the Hill, dominated by the unknown, right, from one election to the other. And to me, that is what the Europeans are using to the most significant extent.
Well, there's a big surprise, right?
Yeah. And so we're now at a point, again, not surprising, but where, especially with the story about the leopards, it wasn't clear until the very end, until a few days after the latest Rammstein meeting, who was hiding behind who. Was it the Germans behind the Americans behind the Germans? But to me, this is sort of a classical, already in this war, situation where Western Europeans are finding excuses, pointing at Washington's political instability when it comes to Ukraine, relative political instability, to say, we are not going to do anything about Ukraine anyway. We do not want to assume leadership, looking at Germany particularly. We want to assume leadership in the French case, but not when it comes to Ukraine. And so we're going to keep it more or less the same. And this, of course, feeds into what my biggest fear is into the next longer term, 1 to 2 years. That the Republicans here are going to get so mad at the eternal burden sharing issue, and that Europeans really on paper are not doing enough, whether that's military aid or reconstruction or financial aid, that this is going to just create a spiral that is going to push us down and down towards the end of the year.
Well, I think
let's look at Dalibor for this.
You're responsible for this.
He's our institution expert.
So the few things going on. One is that it's pretty obvious 1 year into the conflict that there wouldn't be much support for Ukraine and much military aid going to Ukraine if it weren't for the US leadership, if it weren't for the Rammstein group and Secretary Austin really taking a lead on that and pushing the Europeans. And so if that effort is somehow weakened, eroded, broken on this side of the Atlantic, we can't really expect the Germans, the French, others to, yes, the Eastern Europeans, but there is only so much mileage you get out of the Central Eastern European countries, however good their intentions are. There is just only so much capacity. The other question that bugs me is obviously the politics of this in countries like Germany or France. So just to look specifically at Germany, and I want to test this idea on you, Iulia. It strikes me,
German here.
It strikes me that you have parties on the extreme that are more or less pro-Russian, the AfD, Die Linke, maybe the Linke less so than the AfD, but those have limited popular appeal, right? And when you look at German public opinion, the fraction of the German voting public that does harbor a degree of skepticism about military aid to Ukraine is much, much larger than the support for AfD and Die Linke combined, which creates a political opening for one of the mainstream political parties to follow a sort of more reserved, more skeptical line. And that political party happens to be SPD, right? Like the Christian Democrats, the Free Democrats, the Greens are pretty hawkish, like by their sort of usual standards.
CDU is, I'm not convinced about them, but I don't
They're
want to put my
but
finger
they're also
on
an
the scale.
opposition party.
Yeah.
And so there is a real, one could think that there is a real disincentive for Scholz to sort of join the choir.
The choir of
pro-Ukrainian politicians, and he can get much more sort of political mileage out of being the more prudent, so to speak, cautious, skeptical voice, the one who sort of is using the brake pedal more than the accelerator.
Well, isn't it a similar pattern in that regard that both him and others are using sort of public opinion in a parallel to France? The public opinion in Germany and in France is sort of split, but as we've seen with cases in Central and Eastern Europe, when governments have been working hard, pro-Western governments have been working hard to change that, you can do that in a year. You can increase or decrease support for Ukraine significantly through political messaging. And there's this conspiracy maybe theory going around Scholz's day-to-day decision-making in parallel to Merkel before. Merkel used to be known for guiding her decisions only based on polls. And now people are accusing Scholz, including within Germany, German analysts, of guiding himself by polls. And if we looked at the tanks, it was split. It was day by day changing 1 to 2%. But he, at times, more so than in the French case, to me is pushing it too far and seems to be unconscious of the political capital that he's losing within the country and outside. When he goes out and says, well, I met this Polish jogger that told me, why are you helping Ukraine? The whole world is exploding in Germany and to its east, and is ridiculizing him rather. So in this context, Scholzing still remains a mystery. I think you're on the right track that he's using public opinion to his own interest, and I'm pretty sure there's a pretty strong, in SPD, sometimes in CDU as well, but they're not in the focus in the coalition right now. There's a sort of strong lobby that we see behind that maybe will be revealed, maybe will not, but these financial ties to Russia, unlike in other countries, really do exist, and there's significant incentive there. The problem is that he seems to not calculate, and neither does France, and remains a mystery, how much political capital they're losing as sort of the countries that are expected to lead Europeans, and the countries that are expected to think beyond immediate tomorrow tanks or not, and answer the questions of EU membership for Ukraine and NATO membership for Ukraine. They're the two countries that blocked it in the first place when we think back to 2008. So I don't know what this will mean in 5 years from now, that we don't have any willing leadership within Europe.
There's one question is how this war ends, right? Like, so if this war ends in a decisive Ukrainian victory, then Chancellor Scholz will be seen by German public opinion as being on the wrong side of history, right? And I don't think it will sort of benefit him politically. But if this war ends in a sort of frozen conflict kind of situation, or in a sort of stalemate of some sort, or if people in Western Europe just become tired of the support for Ukraine. I bet that his calculus, as did he'll be able to then claim, look, everybody was gung-ho about Ukraine. I was very skeptical from the get-go, and there'll be an electorate willing to listen to that. I think that's the sort of game he is playing. So that's why Scholzing might be sort of explained like within the framework of sort of rational political decision making, I fear. Yeah. And that's why it might be difficult to sort of change. Like we've been sort of waiting for him to get serious for a year now, and he hasn't gotten serious.
Okay.
And I bet there is a reason for that.
Well, but that's prioritizing a very narrow domestic political perspective over two really critical things. I mean,
well, how shocking for a politician.
Well, yeah, but this is getting, it's a hole that he keeps digging deeper and deeper and deeper. He always parrots the Germany must lead. Germany, because of its economy and wisdom and so on and so forth.
Wisdom, first and foremost.
Is bound to lead in Europe. If there's a less than satisfactory outcome on the battlefield, one of the questions will be who lost Ukraine, or who fell short in this time of trial. And I don't see how you can both posture yourself as a leader, but also a symbol of European and German security failure on a scale like this. It reminds me a lot of Woodrow Wilson prior to World War I, who thinks that it's just a squabble between two equally sort of aggressive and acquisitive warring sides, rather than a moral struggle and an ideological struggle as well. I mean, Scholz has shown no sensitivity to that, hardly at all. And what else is the glue that could possibly keep, a fractious Europe together, and the United States continuing to support and play its leading role?
Well, I think, to put myself just briefly in the European shoes, the argument will be, well, there was nothing that we could have done. There was nothing to be won. Russia has nuclear weapons. Eastern Europe remains a difficult buffer zone. So we did the best we could, and this is where we got.
And ultimately, I don't think this conflict ends with a victory. Like Ukraine will not be taken over by the Russians. We've sort of seen that Ukrainians can defend themselves. I think his theory of the case, if I can again, make it sort of tell the sort of Scholz side of the story is that like this is going to be some sort of stalemate anyway. Everybody will be tired of it. Ukrainians will, continue to bleed the prime age men for another year or two, and at some point this will have to come to an end, and by then I will have been the sort of from his perspective reasonable skeptical voice, the cautious one who prevented a nuclear war.
How does that go down in the Baltic states or Poland?
Well, he's not running for office in Estonia.
Okay, so if he wants to be the chancellor, of a coalition government in Germany, maybe that is the safe play, but it is not a recipe for being a leader in Europe at a time where security questions have again come to the fore. It's not a posture that will be endear Germany to a good slice of the American public.
I think that's certainly right. I mean, I was going to test another Germany-related proposition on Iulia, which has to do with the Zeitenwende speech. Mm-hmm. Right. So everybody got excited. I mean, I wonder if
we've gotten over it.
The promise, the premise of the speech was not that Ukraine would lose this war, and therefore Eastern Europe as a whole and sort of Germany's neighborhood would become far more dangerous. And to Scholz's surprise and other people's surprise, Ukraine has proven more than able to defend itself. And in his mind, that actually makes the Zeitenwende speech sound like a mistake, that you want to sort of walk back. And, because Ukrainians are able to defend themselves, we don't really have to do all that much. On the 27th of February last year, it looked like Germany had to do a whole lot. And it looks like, he sort of made this big statement, and now he's been sort of trying to walk it back for an entire year, is my
I think I think you're right. I think there's two elements really to that. This Zeitenwende speech of his is a repeat that we've seen in Germany again and again. I think the most recent one is 2014, just before the Russian first invasion of Ukraine, when Germany, pushed by the United States and other allies, said we will step up, we will take on more responsibility. And they have in their own way, in that they led Minsk 1 and 2. We all know how that turned out, but that's their vision of leadership through diplomatic means, all of that. And they, in 2015, stepped up, going over the heads legally of what they had ascribed to within the EU, and getting in, opening the doors to refugees and migrants. And you can tell each story in a different way, but this is, we all interpreted it differently, but this is what they can supply in terms of leadership. So I think the question is, we cannot ignore Germany at this point, because they're not just the economic powerhouse, but most of Central Europe depends on them economically. And so there's no way to walk back from it, and the only way to look at it is how can we, I guess, anchor Germany, not Central and Eastern Europe that much, but anchor Germany into Central and Eastern Europe so that at least they can match some of the expectations when it comes to economy and driving non-military leadership without expecting too much from them. The question then, I guess, back to you, and maybe Giselle wants to weigh in on that too, is what of the European future?
Yeah.
Where is Ukraine? Sure, that too, but are we looking now at coalitions of the willing more than alliances? Are we looking at some security arrangements beyond the war and during the war that are here to stay, that are enduring, and that avoid Germany, avoid France, and avoid, of course, buying ever again German or French military equipment, because they won't let you use it, right?
I think that's sort of the central question, and it goes beyond just this narrow issue of military assistance, and however important, obviously, it is for Ukraine to win this war and retake its territory fully. I mean, there is also this longer-term question of what happens after the war, and I think there, the West and Europeans in particular have a collective responsibility to deliver on the promise of the 2014 Maidan revolution and the association agreement and now the accession process that's getting underway. And I think that's a really tall order. And however critical we are of the sort of Western European reluctance to provide more weapons to Ukraine, I think, to me, that's even the sort of bigger issue that the administration should be sort of working on and pushing for already, to make Europeans commit to Ukraine's EU membership, because that's what's going to drive domestic reforms. That's the only thing, that's the only chance for Ukraine to really be turned into a sort of success story after the war. And when you think about the reforms that happened since the Maidan and the role played by either the EU or the IMF, like that was going to be central. And my real nightmare for Ukraine is that once this war is over, they'll be placed in the same limbo with the Macedonias and Serbias and all these countries. And the French don't want to enlarge the EU, the Germans don't want to, that would just diminish their voice. in the whole construction. Ukraine is massive. This enlargement thing is going to be very expensive. I mean, Ukraine is half of Bulgaria's per capita GDP in real terms, and I think it's going to be a very sort of steep uphill battle to be fought for Ukraine's place in the EU, and I think we should be already thinking about that now, especially if this conflict ends up in some sort of a frozen situation, stalemate, where there is a disputed border or lack of a formal peace treaty, because that would provide a way out for some of these actors.
Well, so I think those are great questions, and I think you're the one of the three of us to also provide an answer. You know, just to be a little bit more of a devil's advocate, Germany, and I would agree with this, gets big points for reorganizing its energy industry to live without Russian gas supplies, etc. However, they did it in a typically German way by, subsidizing their industry and their populace and keeping the price of, heat down. But it was also a way that, sort of typifies German behavior in the EU in that it pissed off its neighbors. So again, Dalibor, is really a question for you. What would a post-war EU that was really responsive to trying to integrate Eastern Europe into Europe economically, and especially in things like energy and other infrastructure? So it's not just that Germany itself is no longer threatened by Russian economic warfare, but its neighbors are, at least more insulated, if not similarly so. I really wonder, the EU matured during a time of historically unprecedented peace. So this is a big test of whether the EU can survive in more traditionally competitive geopolitical conditions. And
so if I can make my pitch on how to sort of navigate this world, it is just to sort of think beyond the traditional, very sort of bureaucratized and technocratic sort of enlargement template that we know from the earlier waves of EU enlargements, which involved getting all these countries up to speed in every domain of legislation that was relevant to the EU before accession, and meeting all these sort of benchmarks and going through a whole very long sort of laundry list of requirements before being admitted into the club. And it's sort of binary 0-1 kind of situation. I don't think that's going to work in Ukraine's case, because Ukraine will take 25 years to get there, like even under the best of circumstances. What is needed, and I think there is some recognition of that, including from Ursula von der Leyen, who sort of alluded to that, is that it needs to be sort of broken up into smaller chunks, right? So let's front load the economic benefits of the membership in the single market to the Ukrainians as soon as possible, right? Like Norway, Switzerland are in the single market now, not in the EU. Ukraine could do the same, and it would still require some heavy lifting in terms of domestic reforms and sort of legislation being adjusted and standards, etc. But it's less of a lift than full-fledged EU membership. There is no reason why Ukrainian universities and students could not join the Erasmus schemes without Ukraine being a full-fledged member of the EU. There is no reason why already they are connected to the European grid. You can, and there are initiatives like within the 3 Cs initiative to strengthen the interconnections between European countries when it comes to energy infrastructure. I think that would sort of answer some of those questions. And there's also this question of sort of security, right? And a securitization of one's place in sort of these Western alliances and the EU and there obviously either NATO membership or some form of a special relationship with the US would help. In addition to the fact that Ukraine is going to be a pretty powerful and well-armed country at the end of this conflict.
To add to the endless questions that we have today, I'm wary that EU integration, even in these sort of gradual ways, like you're suggesting, which I think makes sense, is actually possible without NATO membership. And it goes back to, most of Central and Eastern Europe, not torn by war, but torn by communism, was really only pushed into the European Union after it was integrated into NATO, again through US leadership. And can you then, in an even more torn, not society, but infrastructure, right, war torn, in this case, Ukraine, can you have significant, functioning, effective investments, foreign investments, when you don't have security guarantees? And I think that's only possible within NATO, and that sort of pushes us to look to how the war can end. And we know it's going to be most likely scenario, messy on certain degrees. So then the problem that now anti-Ukrainianists in the end, anti-Ukraine people are invoking is, well, if you don't have relations...
You can call them pro-Russian.
Pro-Russian, all right. If you don't have perfect relationships with NATO, with neighbors, there's no way you can integrate. And I think this needs to be the discussion around Ukraine and NATO needs to be normalized. I think we have now a bit of a taboo. And we also need to think beyond, this is something that someone's written it down a few decades ago, but it can be changed. Just like in the EU, we managed to do exceptions and look at cases such as Cyprus, etc. So I think we're just putting up paper obstacles that we need to actually talk about and normalize.
Well, we could swap Hungary for Ukraine. That would be,
Its neighbors would be happy.
Yeah, let the people in Brussels figure this out. Before we sort of concentrate on Ukraine, which has been so central to us over the last year and certainly will be for the coming year, Iulia, I particularly would like to ask you about Southeastern Europe, which in some ways has been a dog that hasn't barked as much as it might. Romania, in its sort of sotto voce way, has been a pretty steadfast ally. Moldova remains kind of, balanced on a tightrope or something. And then there's the question of sort of the Black Sea coast more broadly. The Ukrainians have been able to, defend Odessa, take back Kherson, but still not the rest of its Black Sea coast. And then, of course, the Crimean Peninsula sort of remains a key to the whole thing. But what do we need to do to, first of all, what do you foresee for the coming year? Is this a button that the Russians can continue to sort of push as they wish? And is it something that needs more attention from the United States and its European partners, more broadly speaking?
I think it certainly does need more attention, but it's so hard to explain the ways in which the Russians have infiltrated and are creating these problems in these spaces that, in Washington time, you have an elevator speech to explain, and after 30 seconds, people get lost. Like, why, and how can we fix this? But in an effort to kind of centralize some of these themes, Romania has been steady. That's sort of the anchor, right, on the eastern flank, eastern front, but we still don't know whether they're delivering any weapons to Ukraine, and that's a big problem. They've been focusing a lot on Moldova, but Moldova remains very unstable. Maya Sandu is in power, but for how long? We've seen the Russians visibly trying to remove her with protests. Hasn't worked so far, but that's not a given. And in the context of these fears about another full-scale invasion, they're very much of a target. So to me, the most important thing that came out of the last 2 weeks of this space has been President Maya Sandu going to Davos and saying, maybe it's time for Moldova to consider joining the alliance, and we need missile defense systems. So this would be where Romania will have to step up and say, we're supporting both. Here's your Patriot system. Now let's piggyback on others. And I think this still needs to happen, and it can happen with a nudge from the United States. And I think the last element here, or one of the two last ones, just to wrap it up, I think Bulgaria has been, despite being split in public opinion, like we've seen a bit in Slovakia at the beginning of the war, Bulgaria has stepped up. It turns out, Politico article a few weeks ago, that they played a crucial role actually fooling the Russians to deliver energy supplies of theirs via Bulgaria to Ukraine. They've been supplying all these Soviet ammunition necessities that the Ukrainians needed for the older tanks. And they're split, but I think the real estate of Bulgaria on the Black Sea can be ideologically moved to become more anchored in the West. And the last thing in terms of where the Russians are right now, in Romania, again, the bigger country, people are over the last 2 days publishing endless lists of Russian agents or narrative multipliers and websites. It's like 400 websites that have popped up and disappear. And all of them are focusing on Ukrainian minorities and Romanian minorities and all of that Hungarian context. When I was over there a few weeks ago, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Romania made a statement lamenting what the Ukrainians are doing, which is actually trying to push the Russians out, right? And 24 hours later, that statement was congratulated by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Russia. So that's like a low point,
sign.
right? So basically these examples, just to tell, I think it's really complicated. It's hard to sell here because it's so complicated, but of course it's prime real estate. The United States is most present on all the eastern flank over there, and it's safe there, and it's worth building it out, especially to help Ukraine, especially with limited access to the sea. But I think there's a lot more to be done, and we see much better signs always from the north, center and north, right?
Speaking of the center, there's one country we didn't really gotten into very much, which is a country that captivates the imaginations on the political right these days, which is Hungary. And one has to be really worried not only about the influence that sort of the Hungarian example has on the thinking of people on the political right, both when it comes to culture wars and when it comes to foreign policy, but also one has to be worried about the role that Hungary is playing within the alliance and the EU, and when it comes to even basic things like sharing of classified information, when it comes to basic military professionalism. So recently the Orbán government introduced reforms that are going to retire a big part of Hungary's officer corps trained under NATO. And obviously these narratives about minorities being supposedly oppressed in Ukraine, etc. I mean, Hungary has been at the forefront. Current Hungarian government has been at the forefront of spreading these very often pieces of mis or disinformation throughout the public conversation, including on this side of the Atlantic.
Yeah, my least favorite conservative columnist, but the most sort of avid Orbanista amongst American conservatives, quoted Orban. He had another one of his sort of, bromance sessions with Mr. Victor the other day, and he quoted Orban as saying something that I thought was sort of unintentionally true. First of all, I mean, Orban meant to be disparaging Ukraine when he described it as no man's land or no country. I think that is actually true and has been kind of true of Eastern Europe since the end of the Cold War, or the parts of Eastern Europe that we are now most concerned about. These are people who want to be in the West, belong in the West, would be frontline states for the West, but who are under some form of attack from Russia, whether it's through influence campaigns or direct military attack. And he also said that Ukraine was like Afghanistan, but he was intending to refer to the United States. I think actually it's better applied. It's another Afghanistan for the Russians, circa 1979. So, maybe Orban has more wisdom than we might otherwise imagine, but not of the sort that he intends. Let's talk about Ukraine a bit as we wrap up. Dalibor, when we were talking before, you floated, I think, what must be a nightmare scenario for all of us, but something that is worth thinking about very clearly, and that's what happens if Ukraine cannot reclaim all its territory or not reclaim it in a timely enough way, particularly in the next year, to get there before the enthusiasm of its allies is exhausted. Why don't you walk us through what your thinking is on that?
Well, first of all, I think we really have to defer to the Ukrainians on how they want to wage this war, how long they want to wage this war. You can easily imagine a year in which Ukraine will lose tens of thousands of fighting men, and at some point the leadership, the government, the president, and the public opinion will conclude that it might not be worth fighting to retake this or that chunk of Donbass anymore, and or that Russia will manage to freeze the conflict along some sort of line of contact or whatever, and we have to be, I suppose, at that point very steadfast in sticking with the regime of sanctions against Russia. Like, we shouldn't be rushing into offering concessions and sort of normalization of that sort of relationship once the actual active fighting comes to an end. And we should also be ready to make Ukraine sort of succeed long term, however, in whatever sort of shape or form it emerges out of this conflict. And I think there are many sort of reasons to be worried. One is, going back to my roots as an economist, which is like Ukraine is facing tremendous economic damage as a result of this war. We had Natalia Reska on the podcast who talked about the financing gap, 3-4 billion every month that they are fighting. A friend of ours, friend of the show, Owen Drea from the Martin Center, had a piece recently where he says that it's very praiseworthy that we are giving Ukraine all this assistance in the form of loans. However, it might be possible that the Ukrainians won't be in a position to repay those loans. They already are running, over 20% inflation rate, and so unless the West is really generous, you can end up in a situation in which you have a sort of cycle of hyperinflation, a financial crisis, something that could even embitter Ukrainians themselves against the EU and the West. If you add to the mix, a sort of Franco-German reluctance to treat Ukrainians as prospective partners and members of the EU. All I'm saying is that really, however this war ends, the sort of outcome of this sort of wider struggle for Ukraine's successful future, I think is still fairly uncertain, and I think there is a lot of work to be done beyond just the sort of work that's being done on the battlefield.
So then qualifying it to you militarily, does Ukraine, with all of that waning support inside and outside, or the risk of that, is it enough for Ukraine this year to take back the bridge, or do they have to take Crimea to keep things going? Because we know they need Crimea to be able to survive economically in the long term.
I've been thinking about this a fair amount, and let me just try this one out on YouTube. I think the sort of minimum threshold is for Ukraine to demonstrate that it has made a qualitative improvement in its military capabilities. I mean, they have put together not only an heroic defense, but an ingenious one with, bits and pieces and dribs and drabs and baling wire
and even combined arms at times.
Well, that's what I mean. If they can conduct a campaign that, maybe because of the scale, can only produce, a limited success, maybe cutting the land bridge or retaking Melitopol or something like that. I think that will go a long way. And as Dalibor said earlier, the victories in particularly the Kharkiv offensive really bumped up Western confidence and willingness to back Ukraine. So if the Ukrainians can demonstrate that they've digested all the weaponry that they've been given, and maybe if they can integrate a little bit more, or sort of demonstrate that if we give them additional capabilities, that success is in the cards, then I think we live and breathe with hope to come.
In the fall.
Well, I don't know if we can get, putting these things on a timeline. I mean, it's also a reason for the Ukrainians to be super cautious and make sure that when they conduct a counteroffensive, that they've got as many things headed in the right direction as possible. But they've been remarkably, operationally patient. So I think they understand that. And they also understand how their success in the battlefield influences Western opinions. So that's kind of lugubrious in the sense that it's a little hard to see the war ending this year, barring some Russian collapse. But I do believe that there's every prospect of the Ukrainians being on a credible path to victory. So shall we end with a Slava Ukraini?
Well, I would just add that these things are mutually, the political and the military are sort of mutually reinforcing. That like if you have, if Ukrainians end the war, so to speak, on a high note, and if there are uplifting stories to be told about Ukrainian bravery and these sort of military triumphs, I mean, it makes the opposition to Ukraine's EU, NATO membership and to further support, like it makes it, it weakens the sort of Ukraine skeptical side.
And maybe as a last note, looking ahead into the end of next year and beyond, what I think also becomes clear is that no matter when and how this war ends, we here in Washington need a Russia strategy. We need a containment strategy. I don't see anybody talking about it. I don't think it's going to be a rollback strategy, though I wish it were. But beyond that, there's a lot of questions. We know that Russia in some capacity is going to remain a spoiler in the region and on the continent beyond. We know that it fits into the rogue states with nukes, right? We know we have a partnership without limits with China that is creating a lot of worries. And despite us moving here more and more into the redundant Asia pivot, I wish we were already there, right? But beyond that, it will remain an issue that needs to be resolved based on the economic side, how to think about long-term trade and sanctions regimes. On the conventional military side, how to anchor Central and Eastern Europe, because they are the only ones that can hold the fort. And then on the nuclear side, in the long term, having to think about how to design a continent that can be safe from eternal threats and blackmail.
Well, one thing we know is that there'll be plenty of fodder for the Eastern Front, and I'm sure we'll be able to rally again in another year.
That's right.
On that note,
we want to thank you for joining us here on the Eastern Front. And so until next time, and for myself, Giselle Donnelly, and
Iulia Joja and
Dalibor,
we'll see you next time. Thank you very much.